This is the lecture to Chapter 10, Key Issue 1 on Agriculture. Over the next 4 lectures, we will be looking at where did agriculture originate, why people consume different foods, where agriculture is distributed, and why farmers face economic difficulties. Before we get started, one thing we gotta remember for this chapter is a couple terms from from chapter 1, or at least our first unit of study, and that is possibilism versus environmental determinism. Remember, environmental determinism, that's the belief that the physical environment caused social development. This is more for LDCs and prior to the second and third industrial revolution. So as I've said before, it really makes sense to believe in both of these at different times. Some people just disagree on which one is more influential on our world. And again, it kind of depends on who you're talking to, and it depends on which era you're talking about. But most would agree that in less developed countries and before the second and third industrial revolutions, the environment was a great determiner of what human beings could accomplish. It did play a huge role in how developed a people group could be. And then possibilism has in some ways replaced environmental determinism, though again, like I said, some people like Jared Diamond still see environmental determinism to be the truer reality over the course of human history. But this one says the environment may limit some human actions, but people have the ability to adjust to their environment. So when climate limits the crop, people can grow crops that are compatible. So people can adapt. With enough money and irrigation, you can grow something almost anywhere. And if we are talking about crops, 2 examples that seem to support the environmental determinist viewpoint, taro root, or some kind of root, I don't honestly know what that is, versus wheat. If you are living in Papua New Guinea, like Jared Diamond's friends, you're probably going to eat your diet is going to consist of things you can forage for, whether it's berries or the occasional prey that you hunt, as well as some kind of root like this, which doesn't have a whole lot of good nutrients, is pretty labor intensive to dig up, as well as grind into some kind of porridge, or as Jared Diamond described it, some kind of milkshake by adding water to it. Not my kind of milkshake. And the other thing about it is it doesn't have a very good shelf life. Not that you would just leave it around to eat later, because again, in a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, you don't have the luxury of saving food for later because you're always just struggling to get enough calories to get through the day. But even if you had a surplus of this, you can't just put it, store it and save it somewhere, because it will go rancid, it'll go bad. Contrast that with wheat, which in a Western diet is a foundation of much of what we eat. It's in bread, it's in some of the snacks that we eat, and since corn has replaced it as kind of the staple foundation crop, it might not seem as big of a deal. But a grain like this, and corn is also a grain, but a grain like this is huge, because people who live in an area that have this are able to cultivate it so they can grow more of it. But also, once they have it, it can be stored on a shelf. It can be stored for years and allow people to expand their horizons to do more than just farming, because if somebody can farm a lot and they can save it, and somebody else can go do something else. A great example of possibilism would be something like this: this desalinization plant, where salt water is converted into fresh water, which can be used for agriculture and, of course, drinking in Saudi Arabia, which is a desert. Now, they would not have been able to do something on this scale hundreds of years ago, but because of the wealth that they've generated from oil, so much is possible. With that said, let's get back to agriculture, and we want to start from the beginning. Agriculture, what is it? It's the deliberate modification of Earth's surface through cultivation of plants and rearing of animals to obtain sustenance or economic gain. So again, it's deliberate. It's not an accident. You are changing your environment. So anyone could find a blackberry bush and eat the blackberries from it, and that's great, but that's not agriculture. It was just there naturally. Cultivating plants, and also notice that rearing animals, if those animals are for use in eating or helping you cultivate the earth, that's part of agriculture. And you do this for one of two reasons: either to feed yourself or to sell and make money. So the primary idea about humanity's pre-written history, so our prehistory, because you really don't have history without a written record, is that we were grouped into small bands of traveling hunter-gatherers who would follow herds to kill or search for food by foraging wherever. And then something huge happened: the first agricultural revolution, also known as the Neolithic Revolution. Now, this wasn't some event that we have a date for, and sociologists believe it happened in different places, but interestingly enough, around the same time. So, noting that we don't know a whole lot about this, and there are plenty of people who have dedicated their lives to studying what may have happened, but we don't know a whole lot about it. We just know that this is when human beings started domesticating plants and animals. Instead of just finding stuff to eat, we figured out that we could actually find something we like and plant it in the ground and plant more of it. And then you have the diffusion of agriculture. As people started doing it, it started to spread. Other groups started doing it. And then there's the second agricultural revolution, which wasn't that long ago, just a few hundred years. This is where agriculture is industrialized and you're using metal tools to be more productive. Of course, this means that people can grow a lot more food with less human labor. And that means not as many people have to be farmers. The third agricultural revolution, which we are in right now, sometimes called the Green and Gene Revolution, is characterized by very advanced science at a macro level. Micro level. Okay, here goes Mr. B using words he really doesn't know. But the third agricultural revolution involves genetic modification, and that's where you get the gene component there. And also green, because it's much more productive than ever before. Even just in the last 2 decades, farmers have been able to grow so much more food on smaller areas of land And when we studied population, we noted that one of the problems of a growing population is you have to feed everyone. The problem's not really space, but it is how can you feed everyone? And so a problem could be physiological density, right? Do you have the right kind of land to grow stuff? But what has been amazing about modern science and modern agriculture is that in just a little bit of land, people have been able to grow a lot of food by using modern pesticides and fertilizers, as well as highly mechanized ways of planting crops and harvesting them quickly and efficiently. And irrigation has been a huge part of this as well. Instead of waiting around for the rain to come in, we uh, we bring the water to the plants. And you saw that a little bit in the documentary where they have this perfect place to grow stuff in California, but the only problem is they don't have water. But in this third agricultural revolution, we're able to bring water in and only use as much water as we need using advanced sensors and all that good stuff. So in this third agricultural revolution, we have modern agribusiness, and that's one of your vocabulary terms. But modern agribusiness is characterized by uh, a real division of labor. Instead of the self-made farmer who plants the seeds, who tills up the soil, plants the seeds, waters it, lets it grow, takes care of it, harvests the vegetables or whatever, and takes it to the market and sells it. Modern agribusiness has many highly specialized, not many, but several highly specialized jobs. One person might work in harvesting and they get paid by the farmer who may or may not just call himself an input output manager, as the guy in the documentary said. And they'll come in and harvest and they'll travel all over the country doing so. There's the most OG hunter ever. Humanity's only economic activity for at least 90% of our existence was hunter-gathering. I don't know if that's how you say it. Hunter-gatherer populations are characterized by low population densities, and that kind of makes sense. I know you're just mesmerized by this video just as much as I am. And that kind of makes sense because if you don't have a whole lot of food, you can't grow your population. Hunter-gatherers ate a wide variety of natural foodstuffs. Foodstuffs just means different types of food. And they did this because they had to. They could not afford to be picky because they didn't really usually ever have a surplus. This is the only group of people that you will find in stage one of the demographic transition model. And of course, there are very few people on Earth today who have this kind of lifestyle. But one group that does have this kind of lifestyle is the Hadza people who live in Tanzania. There is only about 200 of about 800 of these people who still live in what we would consider to be a traditional hunter-gatherer lifestyle. It's important to note that these people aren't necessarily a snapshot of ancient history. They are modern people in their own way who live in a way that seems extremely backwards to us, but it's not necessarily exactly how their ancestors lived. One thing that's so fascinating about these people is their health. They seem to have a much higher microbial diversity in their gut, and that might keep them from developing things like diabetes and asthma. People who study them are fascinated by how they seem to be lacking in all these so-called modern diseases. And some of those we associate with sedentary lifestyles that we live in the West. Since we've moved on from primary activity, which is pretty physical, working closely with nature, and even moved on from secondary activities, which is still kind of physical, working in a factory, standing up all day. Many of us are just sitting down at computers. And that's, we know, not good for our health. But even more than that, perhaps, is the food that we eat. And people are interested in the Hadza because they eat whatever they can. If they have meat, they eat a lot of meat. And they eat all of it. They eat the fat. If they have honey, they eat a lot of honey, which is like eating a lot of sugar. And yet they seem to be extremely fit even in old age. One thing to note is that they do have a shorter life expectancy. I couldn't find a whole lot of information about the Hadza people, in part because I think a lot is still not known. But I don't know if the life expectancy was because of a high infant mortality rate, or if adults just really don't live very long, or don't live as long as they do compared to the rest of, or compared to Western societies. But I think that's an important thing to consider, because if we're thinking of these people as a model, and a model of health, then that's probably one thing we should consider, not just whether or not that population has things like cancer or diabetes or asthma, but how long are they living? Because we know in our societies, most people don't get these so-called degenerative diseases like cancer until they're older, though they are, of course, far too common. So it's just one thing to consider when we look at this kind of stuff. When we compare populations, are we doing a good job of comparison? That's one of their traditional huts. This shows crop hearths around the world. Agriculture originated in multiple hearths, as I said earlier. Domestication of some crops can be dated back more than 10,000 years. Of course, it's very hard to date other crops because the first agricultural revolution happened before most written records. It's pretty cool to think about living in this time and place that we do experience, and how blessed we are to get to eat so many different cool things. Whereas for so much of human history, people were really limited in what they had access to, what they could eat. So let's go back to the Neolithic Revolution. I just want to talk real quick about some of the primary effects of it. The first being urbanization, because if you're going to plant food, you got to stick around in one place. And if you're going to stick around in one place, you might as well build a nicer house instead of just a little uh, you know, lean-to that you build for a week or a day. Might as well start building nicer buildings. And if you're going to do that, well, somebody needs to get good at building it. And if you're doing agriculture, there's a little bit of room, and of course, not a lot if you're a primitive society, but there's a little bit of room for some people to do something other than agriculture. If I had a pretty good harvest this year, I've got some extra. Maybe I could trade some of it for one of those knives that my neighbor has gotten really good at making. And pretty soon, he gets so good at making them, everybody wants one. And he doesn't even have to do much agriculture anymore because he can focus on that. And there you have the birth of these other trades as people start to branch out and do other tasks. And that might seem like a silly, basic example, but you carry that on through the ages and imagine a society where very few people have to be involved in agriculture. What does that open up the possibility for? Well, of course, it opens up the possibility for people to have all kinds of jobs. And in a country like America, where less than 2% of our population is directly engaged in agriculture, people have some real interesting jobs. There are some people who make balloon animals for a living, and others who test roller coasters. At least I think so. I always heard that that was a job and I wanted it, but I don't know if that's true. I believe it is. Anyway, urbanization is a primary effect. Social stratification is a primary effect. Like I said, some people are going to be farmers, and that opens up room for other people to do things that aren't as directly related to getting food. And that leads to stratification. That's as much a result of agriculture as it is a result of urbanization. And then you have increased population densities, right? And there are some secondary effects, endemic diseases, with people living close together now, sticking around, with population density increased, you do have the greater likelihood of people spreading diseases, and you have famine. The problem is not necessarily that you have some years when you can't produce that much food, but the problem is because you have years when you produce a lot, the population grows. And when we studied population, we looked at how those societies in at least stage 2, which are kind of rooted because they're doing agriculture, their population grows real fast, in part because there's so much food, at least compared to the kind of food that hunter-gatherers get, or the amount of food that hunter-gatherers get. And so if you have this good amount of food and your population is growing, what happens when that food all of a sudden diminishes in supply? Well, you have famine, you have people going hungry. And another thing, another secondary consequence is expansionism. As these people groups developed into cities and then cities expanded into empires, they wanted to expand and exert their influence and their power elsewhere. And we got a system in humanity where we decided we could continue to expand and take over as much land as we physically could. That's more of a history class discussion that I won't get into right now. But I do want you to just see all these things that can arguably connect back to agriculture. And this is why you can find an article entitled, I believe, The Worst Mistake Humanity Ever Made. It's not particularly necessarily one that I agree with, but the premise of the article is that when human beings stopped being hunter-gatherers, we allowed all these terrible things to follow. Whereas if we had stayed hunter-gatherers, we wouldn't have population increase, we wouldn't have expansionism, we wouldn't have these hierarchies where some people are over others, we wouldn't have these pandemics, we wouldn't have famine, we would live like the Hadza tribe where people share and there's no excess. People just have as much as they need, and people are relatively healthy. I'm not going to get into the counter argument to that right now. I'll let you kind of chew on that. But it's an interesting thing to consider. What if humanity had not gone this direction? What if we had not settled down and started farming? you can't really talk about agriculture without talking about the Columbian Exchange, because so many of the foods that are grown in Europe and really across Eurasia and in the Americas would not have been could not have been found in these locales had there not been this exchange. So as Europeans began to travel to the Americas, they took with them livestock, and they brought back with them things like turkeys and potatoes and corn and tomatoes. Can you imagine Italian food without tomatoes? That'd be pretty weird. The significance of the Columbian Exchange is that crops contributing to the population growth around the world were able to do so. Things like potatoes, which are just real hardy, not that difficult to grow, great source of a lot of calories, allowed the population to boom in Europe, especially in places like Ireland. And that's why it became such a big deal when the potato crops became susceptible to diseases, and so many people went hungry, and there was the great potato famine. Anyway, that's just kind of the backstory to the potato famine, which resulted in a lot of Irish trying to come over here to America. It also sparked the migration of millions of people, and it transferred European diseases like smallpox and measles. And as a result, large Native American populations were virtually wiped out. So we talked about the first agricultural revolution. That's the one in which agriculture is more or less invented. Now, the second one is where we get better at agriculture. The second agricultural revolution is characterized by metal plows and reapers and cotton gin and the seed drill, more efficient and quicker ways of planting seeds, of harvesting crops, of turning a raw material like a cotton ball into something usable like cotton that doesn't have the seeds in it. This revolutionized the way in which we do agriculture, and it changed our cultures dramatically, because whereas the agricultural revolution meant that people didn't all have to be involved in hunting and gathering, it still meant a lot of people were going to be involved in agriculture. But the second agricultural revolution eliminated so many jobs in agriculture because one person could do what 100 people could do before. And we also started really focusing on these new crops, these crops from the Americas, potatoes and corn. And there's so much you can make out of that. Part of the second agricultural revolution is also expansion into monoculture, into just growing one thing. Now that really is the hallmark of the third agricultural revolution, but we start doing that in the second one. Again, you need to know this reduced the need for human labor. So what's that going to do to the distribution of humanity? It's going to drive people into the cities. If you can't get a job on a farm anymore, you're going to have to go find one. And this really ushered in a new age of urbanization. I just thought that was a really cool Ford tractor. I took a picture of that in France at a tractor festival. Okay, let's talk about two types of agriculture. When we looked at the definition of agriculture, we noted that you could do agriculture just to subsist, just to live, or you could do it to make money. So subsistence agriculture, the production of food primarily for consumption by the farmer's family. We still see this, though primarily in developing countries. And commercial agriculture is the production of foods primarily for sale off the farm. It's practiced primarily in developed countries and features that distinguish itself from subsistence agriculture, talking is hard, include a lower percentage of farmers in the labor force, high mechanization, so using a lot of machines, and a larger farm size. So again, with commercial agriculture, there's going to be more technology. There's not going to be as many people involved because you've got all this machinery, and the farms are more likely to be much bigger than a subsistence farm. And the other thing that's not on here is you're more likely to just focus on one crop or a few crops and get really good at producing that one crop since you're selling it. Someone doing subsistence agriculture, well, they're not going to want to just eat one thing if they can help it. So they'll usually do more than one thing. I will note that even though we do see this mostly in more developed countries, something called plantation agriculture can be found in less developed countries, especially ones that can grow things that can't be grown in other parts of the world, like coffee or cocoa beans. You'll have large plantations. I don't want you to picture plantations of the South with slaves, but large farms like that where locals are working often for low wages producing one particular agricultural product, whether it's tobacco or cocoa beans or coffee or bananas or something else. And this shows you just another look at the difference in more developed and less developed countries. This is the percent of the labor force engaged in agriculture. In those darkest green ones, it's 50% and above. What I think is really worth noting here is China, because China's an outlier in some situations. You know, we see how much industry is going on in China, and we see the bright lights in the cities, but they still have so many of their people working in agriculture. I think this says a lot about how far China has to come until it's really in the same club as countries like those in North America and Western Europe. But it might just be setting off on a different path, a new path. Maybe the future of developed countries doesn't have to be, only having 1% of the population in agriculture. Maybe it could look different. We're going to wrap up with just two pictures here. On the left, you have the average or a family farm in China. The average size of a family farm there is going to be much smaller than a farm in the United States. That's in the Anhui province, and on the right you've got a family farm in West Brooklyn, Illinois. Again, you're going to have differences not just in the size, but the technology that's being used, which you can see displayed there. So that's it for Key Issue 1. Up next, Key Issue 2.